So good afternoon, and welcome to this post-lunch session. In the case of Galina, she has the interaction between lunch and jet lag, so she will be answering any question. So in this, I'm Javier Pérez. I'm director of the International Economics and Euro Department. So I'm a user of most of your statistics. And so is the purpose of the panel here. No? So we have in the audience a mixture of producers, mostly producers, but also users. And here the idea is to have the view of the users. So be ready to receive a lot of maybe requests and ideas, more or less. No? So it has been quite clear, from the previous discussion that from the statisticians had most or many of the data gaps, and but I guess still we have some around. So in order to have the session a bit agile, we're going to organize a discussion in 3 blocks. Addressing the first block is going to deal with globalization and global value chains. We've heard about this issue before, with this national residence differences and so on and so forth, but other issues will pop up, like the role of services, that of course will be also dealt with in a subsequent. So in the second block, we'll move to climate change, measurement, physical risks, mitigation, transition risks, maybe on food, all these things. And in the third block, we'll be considering, or the panel will be considering some new needs, let's say, that after the experience of the pandemic and subsequent shocks. So these are kind of the blocks. So they will be intervening. Maybe at the end of each block, depending on time, then we'll take 1 or 2 questions, and then I'm sure you will enjoy that. No? For that, as I said, we have a standing panel. So we have Philip Lane, which is a gold medalist, as Angel was saying before. He's quite well known. We're very happy also to have him. Galina Hale, which is professor of economics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's a well-known academic also in these fields. Also on the academic side, we have Carmen Díaz, which is a professor of economics also in Spain at the University of Castilla-La Mancha. She also had a lot of contributions, and you'll see now she has a lot of claims also on this global value change. And last but not least, we have Robert Kirchner, which is a Deputy Director General of the Data and Statistics Directorate at the Deutsche Bundesbank. So, without further ado, then let's start with Carmen, you want. So let's start with this block 1. What's your reviews? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javier. First of all, I want to thank Maria and Juan for inviting me to this roundtable. Although the last decade has been important improvements in services trade statistics with many experimental statistics such as balanced trading services, that is, trading services data by mode of supply, TISMOS, trading value added, IVA, and services trade by enterprise characteristics data set, STEC. They still have many limitations for tracking globalization and global value chains participation, since both are changing and becoming more immaterial, more non-physical and digital. We observe that changes because when we look at the strong increase in the trading services since the Great Recession and the growing role of services as intermediate inputs in global value chain. I want to divide my main short presentation in 3 groups of comments, 2 related to macro level analysis using country industry data sets, and 1 related to firm level analysis. This is my particular Christmas letter to the 3 wise men. My first set of comments is related to BATI's data set, which is based on balance of payment statistics. And I think it has several shortcomings. First, data should be available with a shorter delay to monitor these changes in globalization through the rise of digital delivery of services as new forms of migration such as telemigration. Second, we need a higher disaggregation by industry. Specifically, we need a breakdown of the category telecommunication, computer and information services to separate computer and the so-called modern services, information services. And we also need data for the complementary group C3 software transition. 3, will be interesting to have data separately from related party and unrelated party transition. I know that this is already planned through the complementary group C5, total services transition between related companies, but as far as I know, data is not yet available. 4, we need an extended BATIS data set combining data from TISMOS database to cover also GATS mode 3. To have this information, it is required to include in the questionnaire 2 firms, which is the weight represented by each mode of supply and not only the priority mode. 5, for researchers, it's really important to incorporate estimates of domestic trade flows in this extended BATIS for an accurate estimation of which are the effects of trade agreements on trade flows when we use structural gravity frameworks. And the last one referring to BATIS data set, we need data not only of the value of trade flows, but also on the number of exporting firms for analyzing, for example, how a shock influencing both margins of trade or how trade agreement boosts the number of trading firms. My second group of comments also refer to macro level statistics. To capture this new channel, services related channel for global value chain participation, we use TIVA dataset to analyze how countries' exports are increasingly incorporating foreign services, the so-called Mode 5 of trading services, which is in turn related to an increasing servicification of manufacturing. But TIVA is publishes with a long delay, and its sectoral aggregation is too high, specifically for digital industry. For us, for researchers, it's really important to break down the J62 to 63 code. So we refer to computer programming, consultancy, and information services activity to capture how the first is the key driver for the change towards a more digital globalization. Moreover, in the construction of input-output tables, a very strong assumption is that each industry has unique input structure irrespective of the destination, domestic or foreign, of each production. And some estimates on whether there are differences in this input structure will be very useful for researchers. An alternative to capture mode 5 of services, of trading services, to split data into intermediate and final services using the conversion of the eBooks 2010 items to BEC revision 5 codes. I know that this dataset is really offered by Eurostat, but no bilateral data is available, and the reporters are only the European Union countries. My third and last comment refers to firm level data, because macro level analysis very often hide heterogeneous firms' behavior, and the results sometimes even contradict each other. The development of the European TEC statistics represents a major step forward in integrating service trade data into business statistics. They offer data on value and trade flows disaggregated by 3 specific firms' characteristics: size, economic activity, and type of ownership. We are looking forward to have access to the first official STC dataset at the end of the year. And here our researchers are the following. We need panel data. Data is currently a strongly unbalanced panel, having a lot of missing data for several countries and years. Again, we need information not only on value of trade, but also on the number of exporting firms. We need bilateral data. The breakdown by trading partner location is currently limited to extra European Union and world. And for us, it will be useful to have information on other firms' characteristics, for example, labor productivity, percentage of skill exploited, and the gender, please, of the owner of top manager of the firm. And the most important, my last desire, we need access to microdata. We understand that confidentiality is important, but in countries where researchers have access to microdata, much more progress is being made in understanding how to boost trading services, which is the sector where the European Union has his main comparative advantage. Finally, more efforts could be dedicated to complement official data with private big data sources, such as online credit characterization through collaboration with financial institutions. I think this is important that central banks and national statistics officers lead the development of experimental statistics to offer harmonized and timely data to research and policymakers. Since the high demand of this data, private data sources are emerging when particular private interests could influence data published. So we can afford it because data is the new oil, and we need that the development of these new statistics respond to common interests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmen. You really took a list, no? Galina, which are your views?
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit. Is this on? I don't know. Oh, thank you. My work on global value chain is limited to the macro level, and I've been working with World Input-Output Database, whoever put it together, many thanks to them. I understand that it could be built based on the domestic input-output matrices and trade data, but it's not something that every researcher can easily do, so that WIOD was not updated since 2016. I imagine people probably didn't get a grant renewed or something like that. And so having some version of global input-output database with the industry codes that are somewhat harmonized to other data sources, I think is going to go a long way towards understanding the fragility and robustness of supply chains at the industry level. I think we don't need to convince people that it's an important issue after the supply chain crisis during the pandemic. So I think when those problems are revealed, it makes it easier for us to make a case that we need much better data in order to understand where the bottlenecks are and how these bottlenecks can be measured. Another example of global value chain importance to policies, and when it comes to trade wars or tariffs of any kind, because the tariffs tend to be imposed on whatever good crosses the border rather than the total value of the good rather than value added. So one exercise I did as part of my policy work back at the Fed was to figure out if there is a tariff on imports from Mexico, how much impact is it going to have? Well, it's going to really depend on how many times the good going to cross the border between the US and Mexico by the time it becomes a final good. If we're imposing a 15% tariff every time, it might be 150% tariff on value added. So things like that are extremely important to know. And so, if I can add to the wish list, having, I know ADBI has, Asian input-output, international input-output matrix, and it's been extremely useful. And it has also data on Chinese provinces. So it's not just international, but it's also within regional for large countries can also be quite important. So just a couple of cents to add to that.
Thanks so much. Yeah, more issues there. Do you want to pop in, Philippe?
So I think everyone here would probably be in the corner. I mean, we do say, of course, we care about the reporting burden on firms, but by and large, we want to know everything about everything. But we have to take seriously that essentially this runs contrary to the business strategies of multinationals, where essentially they don't want to share tons of information with even the most trustworthy national statistician, let alone a national statistician which has some research lab where some academic might have access. So what I would say is there's an interesting, so I'm going to be very parochial here about the EU, because I think we need to have a good understanding of the world economy. And if we think about the EU, I'll say EU, I mean whether it's EU, your area, whatever, as a kind of an economy, which has lots of internal linkages across countries. Think of the car industry, which has tentacles across Europe, and also to the extent, versus knowing everything about everything. So if we, and this goes back to what I said this morning and some others, if we had a single reporting by multinationals for the EU, we don't know everything because they're global firms, but having a more coherent way to think about the EU in the world economy would be very important. Because in the US, how a big US firm organizes itself across the US states is, of course, super interesting for many reasons. And I think there's been one of the big research kind of improvements in the last 15 years has indeed been exploitation of regional data in the US. We've learned a lot about the concentration of activity, the role of local labour markets. So there is a lot there. And of course, my starting point, I want to know everything about everything. But in terms of moving forward, I do wonder whether it might actually be possible to develop an EU view. And with the people here today in this room, now of course, in the end, it's for legislators to deliver this. But in terms of really trying to filter out what is our kind of priority A, priority B, priority C, because the temptations are a really long wish list. But maybe it's more effective to focus on a small number of things. And again, for me, so that's my other point though is that we need to match the work of statisticians with economists, because in the end we need to have a coherent kind of vision of how global transmission works, complementarities versus substitution. We at DCB last year is important, and I'm sure the IMF has done it, I'm sure the Fed has done it, gone through various fragmentation scenarios. What happens if the global economy fragments and you have to switch away from the cheapest global input into some local alternative? I think that work is reasonably good. I'm not so sure it would be a lot better with a kind of much more data. So it depends on the question we want to ask. The other point I think is case studies or industry studies. We have business school colleagues in universities who actually will say, I know everything about the chemical industry. One thing I've been found useful recently is the periodic, I don't know if it's a press release or a quarterly bulletin from the German chemicals industry. So they as an industry body explain what is facing them as a structural challenge as an industry. And there's a kind of, I think there's some value to really understanding, because you were talking about breaking up the computer IT, and absolutely that's a bundle of different industries which are quite different. But I think there are also people maybe we could turn to who are doing that from a strategy point of view, business strategy, and again, whether universities or places like McKinsey, there are some people who. So from a policy point of view, how I get the data between hard data, surveys, and I would say for us at DCB, we have heavily emphasised in recent years what's called the corporate telephone survey. So it's a structured survey, but I think we learn a lot. Even if these corporations are not handing over their full data set in terms of answering some big questions, that survey I think is helpful. So my roundabout element with that is maybe there's value, if you have a particular question in mind, maybe there's some value in kind of very specific surveys, as opposed to Martin had a 15-year estimate for changing the SNA, or someone else this morning, Stephen I think it was. So I've heard numbers like that. Again, trying to have some possibilities for near-term progress could be helpful.
Yes, thanks a lot. So I think I'm here also to complement the panel from the statistical side, since I've worked all my career, more than 30 years, in the statistical domain. So perhaps let me comment on one aspect that we also discussed quite extensively in the morning, the issue of consistency. And that has, let me say, many, many dimensions. And we also discovered it during our first talks. We have, on the one hand, consistency between balance of payments and source data. Very important, because we want to have microdata, which brings it down. We are talking about consistency inside balance of payments, because we do not want to have errors and omissions. That makes life really difficult. We are talking about the connection between frameworks, balance of payments, financial accounts, and also national accounts should be consistent. And last but not least, we would like to have it internationally, not only European, we would like to have it international. If I think about the big asymmetries between Europe on the one hand side and, for example, the US on the other side. So if we think about, if we agree we would like to have that, let's spend just a moment to think what that really means as a statistical work program. First of all, and I think we will have also sessions tomorrow, consistent data requires as a necessary condition consistent manuals, BPM, SNA, but also consistent classifications, ISIC, CPC, etc., etc. That's the basis, I would like to say. And at least my information, sometimes there are still discussions ongoing, but we should have in mind, if we don't have consistent manuals, we will not have consistent results at the end. But even, let's assume we have consistent manuals, what we also need is a consistent interpretation. I mean, we also know it, let me say, if there are two lawyers in a room, you may have 3 different interpretations. With statisticians, it's not different, not at all. So even if it's relatively clear, we need a joint interpretation. And of course, we have good, let me say, work which is going on. The IMF offers some trainings. We have a lot of working connections. The IFC also offers. So that it's on the way, but it's in addition. But let's imagine we have consistent manuals. We have a consistent interpretation. Do we have a consistent implementation? The one issue which you also mentioned is data sharing. And I would like to say in Europe it might be much easier than internationally to be done. But data sharing is a conditio sine qua non. Otherwise I never come to the issue, because at a certain moment I really would like to know what is the real story for a multinational enterprise. So we need that, and I think there is good work on. We have recommendation 14 of the G20 Data Gaps Initiative, also recommendation 13 is somewhere therein. We have IFC guidance note, we have the legal identifier, etc., etc. And by the way, I really think that, for example, the IMF plans to set up a task team on global asymmetries with members of BOPCOM as well as representatives from other member countries and international organizations are really a step forward, which shall be done. Now let's assume we have perfect data sharing. We have a consistent interpretation. We have consistent manuals. Do we have consistent estimations? I mean, we are talking about missing values. We are also talking about late incoming values. We also talk about the issue on perhaps, what is it, FISM, which is more or less estimated in poor terms. So let me just perhaps conclude. It's really much work to do. And let me also say, I think we cannot expect that these statistical differences will fully disappear. But anyhow, I think the demand for consistency is one of the main drivers that we have in statistics, because it covers all these areas from the manual up to the implementation and estimation that we have to look at. And therefore, I think it is more than useful work program. And I've taken all the other things as a confirmation on this work program. Thank you.
I think you were the covered guy in the panel, really. No, that's fine. No, great. I mean, we can get like a couple of burning questions you want. There were many issues: immigration services, digital globalization, trading flows, regional in large countries, granularity. I mean, bottlenecks. Any reaction? Yes, please. This makes, for some time, if anyone else wants to think about the question, then in a second we'll begin. I don't want to launch a question because otherwise we'll start discussing here. One. Yeah. So let's we'll try to give you some room, but then let's move to the end. So we talked about global value chains, globalization. No mic. So let's move to the second block, and then I will take your question now. Thank you for that. No? So Galina, on climate, how do you see it?
Thanks, and I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this conference. I've been a data user and a data nerd for at least 25 years now. So, yes, being in the room of data producers, of course, very tempting to make a wish list. So I'm going to talk about the climate data. And given that we're still at the beginning of understanding climate change, I would say, as an economic profession, I want to take a step back and think about what is that we want the data to do for us, right? So kind of in the spirit of Phil's comment that we need this connection between policy analysis and the data collection. So I think there are three things in that respect that I want to mention. First, of course, we want to have data for risk management, financial risk management in particular. There is risk from physical damages from climate change. There is also risk of a green transition. And that has been kind of addressed in a large extent thanks to NGFS, Network for Green Financial System, has put a lot of work into this. And we have a framework, TCFD, for reporting those risks. There's a recent paper by Hartzmark and Xu that raised a potential issue with the incentives created by this kind of climate risk, in particular transition risk reporting that has to do with the incentives that investors just take money out of the highly emitting sectors, therefore raising the cost of capital for those firms than the capital they need to transition to greener technologies. So you take money out of the utilities and you put money into, I don't know, insurance. It does not help green the system, right? Because the insurance is not a substitute for energy production. And so I think a little bit more thinking needs to be done in that sense. And so we need to actually have incentives for investing in green transition, which right now is a very small sector. And I think one thing that is important for that is that we stop talking about green versus brown, because it's very confusing, and I think it might be confusing intentionally by financial industry in the sense that they can say, look, my balance sheet is green because I moved money out of brown. Well, but that does not really mean that the balance sheet is green, because they didn't move money out of coal burning into solar panels. They moved money out of coal burning into a neutral industry. So we need to think about three industries. There is an industry that's producing greenhouse gas emissions. There is an industry that does not, just because it's not a part of production function. And there is an industry that is actually providing solutions. And the important thing about that is not just that we need to think about it more clearly so that the models, in fact, reflect. I mean, I'm not going to go on the whole rant about that. But it's also important to understand that investment in green technologies, be that climate mitigation technologies or climate adaptation technologies, is a hedge for climate risks. So from financial institution point of view, instead of divesting from the brown sector, what you can do is invest in a green sector, which is going to have a negative beta with respect to, say, carbon tax. And similarly, you can hedge physical risks of climate by investing in climate adaptation. The more damages we have, the more valuable this climate adaptation is going to become. So that's kind of a background I think is important. Now, given that we don't really have any consistent data on climate, I would say, is a great opportunity to really think about what kind of data do we want. And so I have a few thoughts on that. So we have this opportunity to design the manuals, right? We don't have any climate data manual, there's TCFD. So a couple of thoughts on measurement. So on mitigation, We have 3 greenhouse gases, even though we talk about carbon, it's really all about carbon equivalent, and the reporting on non-carbon is much worse than on carbon, yet the other greenhouse gases are a lot more potent. And one thing that people don't really know necessarily is that while carbon has a really long lifetime in the atmosphere and the other gases too, the one that doesn't is methane. After 10 years, methane turns into carbon, which is good because methane is about 30 times more potent than carbon. So if you want to reduce the stock of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, you want to reduce methane emissions as fast as possible. That's like the lowest hanging fruit. Another thing is that there are 3 emitting sectors that people usually think about energy, but energy is not really a sector. Energy is service to other sectors. The most emitting sectors are industry, utilities, be that urban or suburban, and agriculture. And agriculture does not get enough attention. We are not measuring emissions from agriculture very carefully. We're all focused on transport. Transport is a tiny share. Everybody makes fun of me flying to conferences to talk about climate. Air transport, 1.2% of total emissions. Agriculture, between 18 and 30, depending how you measure. So. The third point on mitigation is that duration really matters. So I mentioned already methane. If you emit a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere and then you plant enough trees that technically are going to remove a ton of CO2, yes, it kind of makes sense. The problem is the trees are not going to live for 200 years. So you need to match, if we were going to really talk about carbon liabilities, if you will, we need to have carbon assets of matching duration. So that's discussed in great detail in Alicia Seeger and co-authors at Stanford. They're proposing framework for carbon accounting that also takes a step away from the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, which has a lot of double counting problems. So if you're interested in that, I can send a reference. I think it's really good. And very quickly on adaptation, absolutely under-researched, partly because there is not enough data. We need to understand the difference between potential risk and actual realized events. There is a nice paper by Helen Popper and co-authors that shows that the equity response is very different to, say, a probability of flood and to actual flood. And that's an important question from financial stability point of view. And we also need data on physical and financial adaptation to climate risks, because from physics, we have really good data on what the climate hazards are, but the hazards do not translate to the risks to property, people, and environment directly. It depends on what we do to protect ourselves against those hazards. And it's important to measure those benefits from adaptation because we want private sector that benefits from adaptation to be investing. We cannot solve the climate problem with public money alone. And so my conclusion, basically, I'm on a mission to figure out how do we get private financial sector involved in paying for climate solutions, because we do not have enough money in the governments or NGO sectors. And solid data is like a first step to creating incentives for attracting financial sector money. So that's my pitch.
Thanks so much. Let me ask you a follow-up question, no? Because you were talking about these potential risks versus actual events and then private sector investing. No? Of course, there is something in between that you also alluded to, which is insurance, no? In a sense. No? So it's kind of there are developed markets. For insurance of events that we've seen in the past, it's more difficult to have insurance for events that we haven't seen. No? And that's where the private sector enters. Do you have some follow-up thoughts on that issue of insurance? No? Because you were just going over.
Yeah, $1 trillion questions. So insurance, I think is important. I think insurance companies are actually among the private sector the best at factoring in moving distribution of this climate-related events, right? Because it's their bottom line that's at stake, and so, right. And so I think essentially, kind of the way I see what private institutions need to do is figure out what is happening to the distribution of the arrival rates of these events. And again, like for things like hurricanes, the physicists told us what it is, because you can predict the ocean temperature and stuff. Much harder to predict wildfires, hot days, and things like that. And so I think here the insurance industry is going to need a lot of support from the governments, not necessarily in financial sense, but in the technical sense. And I think also insurance industry is likely to be a leader in investing in adaptation, because again, it's their bottom line that they can protect. So right now, insurance companies are just leaving the areas of California that is not profitable for them to insure because they have limits on how much they can charge. California Department of Insurance is very interested in adaptation because they're trying to reduce the risks enough to get insurance to come back. And so that's where, trying to price how much we can actually reduce the risks by putting, a seawall or better materials to build houses. We need this kind of estimates in the models. And that would also affect, of course, like a bank climate stress testing, for example, because you're looking at the exposure of the banks to physical risk through their borrowers. I don't know if I really answered your question.
Do you want to add something from here?
Well, first of all, maybe I'll just advertise for those of you who don't spend enough time on the ECB website that the ECB has been releasing climate change related indicators, and there's going to be more coming out this year. So these indicators, one set covers sustainable finance, another set covers carbon emissions, another set covers physical risks, because we need it for banking supervision to feed our macro models and so on. So that's just some advertising. But then let me come back to the issue about external statistics. So trade and investment flows, because of course climate change, to say the obvious, is a global issue. There's clearly a huge investment gap. There's investment gaps everywhere, but part of the, I think, consensus is there needs to be a big capital flow to those emerging developing countries, which need to do a lot of abatement in different ways. So having ways to classify the flow of finance, which maybe the World Bank is doing it, I don't know, that's one. But also with FDI, because FDI, the optimists would say there's an amazing potential here. If you get the firms which do invent new technologies, and we need ways to diffuse those technologies around the world. Some of it can be done by licensing, but a lot will be done through FDI, I think. And so having FDI statistics which really track, is it a case we're seeing what we need to see in terms of the growth rate of FDI in those sectors, I think would be important. And also trade. I mean, obviously, when various parts of the world try to do carbon border adjustment taxes or equivalent non-tax policies, thinking about this is very important. Because behind everything, in terms of thinking about the economic impact, it's the elasticity of substitution. There's different elasticities of substitution. We had this 2 years ago with the debate about Europe and the ability to substitute away from Russian gas. But more generally, anything that helps us feed into thinking about the substitution possibilities, which clearly are greater substitution elasticities at longer horizons. But I think on top of all the general data needs, the cross-border elements I think are very important.
Short comment. From the international trade point of view, we have data on trading environmental goods, and it's important because we have analyzed which countries produce these goods and which countries has a comparative advantage of them. But again, we don't have any data about services. In the EBUPS 2010 classification include a category specifically for these services, waste treatment and decontamination, agricultural and mining services, but data is again not available. I think this is an issue for which we need to collect the data. Thank you.
So, your view.
Just to tell a short story. So last week, met my governor. I sat close to him, and then he said, well, we talked about sustainability data quite in general, and then he started, well, Mr. Kirchner, I just have one wish. Please make reliable data. I had no chance to answer because then suddenly the next point came in. But I reflected a little bit on this sentence. So first of all, I would like to say there is some truth in it. So private household needs reliable carbon footprints for making their decisions on consumption. We should not forget. Companies request accurate carbon footprints for determining their input structure, which is very important. Investors require informative green labels, avoiding the misinformation from greenwashing. And for political decision, and I think also for the input of all these three groups that I mentioned before, we need qualitatively highly and up-to-date statistics. And let me also conclude, I think none of these conclusions are currently met. So let me just two or perhaps three reflections. The one is on data availability. And with regard to data availability, I remember that we had in the Irving Fisher Committee at the World Statistics Congress last year a session. And in this session, all presenters, brilliant. But there was one thing which were in common. They all brought together financial, non-financial, and environmental information, all from different sources, all from different providers, whatever. So everything what we discussed for data sharing, etc., in the other fields, I would like to say, is still relevant here, and perhaps even more pronounced. Secondly, with regard to data quality, we made an investigation at the Bundesbank for greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2, from different data providers. And with regard to reported data or partly estimated emissions. And just these two data that were in common for the same enterprise, and even if they're reported, they have a difference of the CO2 footprint of about the factor, I'm not talking about percentage rates, the factor 10, 100. There were also cases for 1,000, and even there were a few cases of 10,000, let me just say. So I'm just on the data quality and the point of producing reliable data. But I think to give some hope, I would like to say much is going on in the field of statistics and ESG reporting, standard setting, and corporate accounting. And I think this is something that perhaps can bring us forward. And I particularly think about all what is going on in the area of the International Sustainability Standards Board or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, which is currently ongoing in Europe. And this gives hope for me in the following super consistent framework, because we're at the very beginning here. So we have the chance, together with standard setters and together with firm accountants and statisticians, now to bring together and to produce environmental data provided by the enterprises about products and also about their establishments. We are on the way, with regard to European legislation, at least in Europe, to have disclosed information on their product labels and somewhere in the financial statements. That's important. And here we have to think about how we can come in. We have that quality assured by supervisors, available in a standardized format because of the European single access point that will come out in a couple of years and because of ESMA. And we can use it then perhaps in statistics and by investors, consumers, ministries, etc. in let me say, coordinated way and perhaps efficiently organized without data being collected or compiled more than once. So I think this is important to bring these players together. And by the way, this is exactly what we try to do next week when we have an IFC workshop on these issues. You can still register virtually. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. No, clearly, I mean, in these areas where you have one of the formidable trade-offs, no, that you face are between this reliability and availability, no? So let's go straight to the third block. I mean, there's some new, lessons from the pandemic, but and to avoid that, Robert, let's have your cards in the table before it's been very useful. So we're going to start with you and then come back to the others. Thank you. Go ahead.
So with the third question was in new data sources and in particular to learn what we have learned in the pandemic. So perhaps let's remember Directly after the last IFC conference and ECB conference organized in Portugal on external statistics, COVID-19 spread rapidly around the world. I'm not saying that it is a fault of this conference, and I'm not saying that it shall happen again, but it simply happened by coincidence. So fast political decisions and the implementation of drastic measures were really necessary to slow down proliferation and counter the economic disruptions. And to prompt and calibrate unprecedented policy measures, the demand for broad, timely, high-frequency statistics about economic and health developments surged. That was the demand side. So let's think about the supply side. At the same time, official statisticians were faced with disruption in their data flow from the enterprises and households. The rapid diffusion of the pandemic outpaced the frequency at which most conventional statistics become available. Not all firms were in a position to provide data as usual. So more estimations were needed. And in addition, estimation procedure need to be adjusted very soon to the new situation. We cannot learn from the past with ARIMA models that totally failed. All the things in the program have to be reprogrammed, let me say, to bring the appropriate answer. So compared to the 2007 and 8 financial crisis, the good thing is much more granular data is actually digitalized and stored somewhere, and digitalization boosted the amount of the data available. I think that's what we all know. And here again, we have this point that we really need the access to privately held data, that we need also data sharing, and I do not want to replicate it here. But I think the role of official statisticians to provide policymaker and the public with independently compiled and relevant data of high quality, as expressed in the UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. So the major lessons learned from COVID-19 for me as statisticians is that we shall be prepared and flexible enough for future unknowns. And we shall enable users of statistics to quickly tap on data dimensions and relationship needed for their decisions when confronting with exceptional circumstances. So I think this calls, let me say, or has a couple of consequences. First, I think it calls for well-defined framework for international and interdisciplinary cooperation. Based on the progress in the thematic field supported by the sharing of microdata, like anonymization, access regimes and technique, as well as learning from international initiatives of data sharing in non-statistical areas. Data sharing works well in payments, very good in supervision, and in taxation also. In statistics, we have certain hope, but we are, I would like to say, not there. In addition, it would be useful to assess the effectiveness of a statistical data standard promoted by international organizations and underwritten by states as an important step forward, overcoming current hurdles to international data sharing and data access while safeguarding data privacy. And this is exactly, I think, what we have in mind with recommendation 14. We need the signatures there. So to fulfill the role in the digital age, I think official statistics need to transform the whole statistical value chain to become faster development. From benefiting of new data in enterprises in the collection phase, more cooperation with the private sector and data firms, via using artificial intelligence in the compilation phase to standardize data publication and international data sharing in the distributional phase. And let me just say, making flexible and making it faster, I would like to say there is a lot of things that we have to think about in our future projects with regard to making things faster and using the modern technology that we perhaps cannot think about coming out 30 days later. Perhaps we can think about 3 days. And this is what I would like to say, think for doing our investment in this regard. So that should be the starter for the discussion. Thank you.
Philip, you want to come in?
So, I mean, obviously, I agree with a lot of those points. I'd also say we have to remember we care about low frequency as well as high frequency. And I think the annual national accounts often are kind of, because one thing we've got, even with the national accounts, is, months later there's a revision. And there's a trade-off. Having a flash, which then turns out to be downright misleading, is not particularly helpful. So speed versus accuracy, is not always, speed is not top of my list. because you can overreact to noise. But I agree with being ready, and I think there's an amazing response in response to the pandemic, in finding ways to work out what's going on. I think also with the digitalization of services, we do need to, there are some issues where you say, yes, absolutely, this is a superior data set. It should be possible to be continuously informed by this data. So where that's possible. But going back to what I said earlier on, in the end, a lot of economic activity is produced by firms. The whole point of a firm, if you think about Holmstrom, Tyrrell, Hart and so on, is to avoid market-based transactions. There's a lot of internal activity within a firm, and the firm exists because the market doesn't do a good job. And being able to peek inside a firm on a minute-by-minute basis, I'm a bit skeptical. So where it works, and where it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And so we should maintain that balance. But in the financial world, because there's so much data every second, that using in terms of collecting credit card data, payments data, transactions data, which we have in different ways, all of that is to the good. But in terms of production and consumption decisions, smoothing out day-to-day volatility, there's value to low frequency as well.
Well, I just want to add really briefly that as a data user, I'm very thankful to all the data producers in the room. I think that needs to be said. But also, one thing I think we learned from the pandemic is that in a situation like that, when is a shock that's completely new, that we cannot use our past learnings to make policy recommendations, we saw like a burst of COVID-related research as early as 2020, and that was relying on some very creative data sources, credit card, traffic, satellite imagery, and I think, some of the problems with, firms not wanting to report stuff could be resolved by using what's in kind of public access. You have satellite imagery that could be used for stuff. I think there's quite exciting opportunities with artificial intelligence and, machine learning and things like that we also can explore going forward to solve some of the trade-offs between accuracy, at least as a backup, checking the information and things like that, I think could be super useful.
We have like 5-10 minutes for questions. So start here because it was a pending question.
Thank you very much, Ulrich Schubert, Vienna University of Economics and Business. Coming to this single reporting on multinationals, I think there is agreement here between the users and the producers that this would be extremely important crucial to understand the workings of the modern digital world, global world. So for external statistics, that would be important. Now, having been around for a few years in statistics, I remember that 23 years ago, there was an initiative of the Dutch Central Bank on multinational reporting, initiated by a letter from the CEO of Philips to Mr. Welling, that why do we have to report so for so many different ones? Why not one single reporting? There was a big initiative. There were a lot of business trips to Carlsberg, Philips, etc. Until we went to Nokia, and Nokia said, "You want to know from us what's going on in Nokia? We don't know what our subsidiaries are doing. Everybody is independent." For the younger ones, Nokia used to be the biggest mobile phone producer. So obviously the time was not yet ripe for it. And so the question is now, since there is obviously disagreement, so what's different today, or what's needed today to get a political momentum to do this? And I guess there might be also an interest on the other side to have a single reporting instead of having a lot of compartmentalized things. So to Philip, but also to the others, what could be done, or who should be doing what, so that we are not just talking about it now repeatedly, but really something happens. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
we're very disciplined with the microphones. On climate, there's a huge interest in data for climate, and you see that everywhere. I was at COP28, and it was almost in every session. On the mitigation part, I think there are these standards. So it's basically doing, and we know what to do. It's just a lot of work. But on the adaptation, it's different. Basically, you want to know what's being done, how is it financed, and what's the effect. Well, the effect is in terms of risks. You got the network of greening financial sector scenarios. Well, this is at least an entry point. We're working on that. But for the other two, what is done, what's spent, and how is it financed, there's a big standardization problem. So how do you measure subsidies and expenditures in a comparable, standardized, international way? And green finance, even worse. In the Data Gaps Initiative, we're trying to do some standardization, but we cannot do this alone as statisticians. We need to work together with the regulatory authorities. So I'd like to have your views, maybe especially of Philip, but maybe also Robert and Javier. How are we doing in this respect? Are we coming to more standardization on what is a green bond, what is ESG, finance, subsidies, expenditures? What are developments in Europe, and how far can we get?
Yes, many thanks. So I listened with a lot of interest to all the things that you mentioned, and I wrote down very clearly all the lists that we got, certainly from the users. I have to say I have a few key conclusions. One is that external statistics is really the most interesting area to work, because I think it really showcases all the issues that we've discussed, really about how does our world function and how do we measure it. I think that's the core of what we're trying to do, and I think this really makes our work interesting. My second conclusion is you are all extremely right. The users, for all the users' needs. I recognize a lot of the work programs that I've worked on in the past, as well as that I'm currently working on. I'm also thinking that Robert was extremely right in defending valiantly the perspective from us as statisticians. I'm like, well, we'll probably not be able to do everything by this afternoon. So what I was really looking forward to, and this was my third point, is what can we do going forward from here? And I've heard one very concrete suggestion, which is the single reporting by M&Es, given that's been mentioned twice by someone with your stature, Mr. Lane. I can guarantee you I will continue thinking about how we can organize something along those lines within Europe. But I'm also thinking that more is needed. Because what I think is what is needed is more than just users on the one hand side of this table giving a list of requirements and things that they would like to see, and on the other hand statisticians saying like, well, it's very complicated and we need to do a lot of different things. So I think we need to step forward, and how can we accelerate and scale up the collaboration in a systematic manner that allows us to work together as researchers and as statisticians, and not in a user-producer, but in a joint way, where we can see what are the key problems that are tackling our society today in this field, and how can we provide answers, making a joint trade-off between quality and speed and reliability and consistency and all these types of things. So are there, and of course new technologies will be able to help us, but what I'm increasingly thinking about is to think of a kind of a lab situation where you have people working together, thinking about what is really needed, not for my personal research question as an individual researcher, but what is needed to bring my subject area further and to enhance our global insights. And I think this is the area, and this reflects to our way of working across the fields, that we need to invest in and need to think about how can we bridge this, because otherwise we'll be in 5 years' time in a similar conference with slightly more data, a slightly longer user request, and we'll have the same discussion. So I'm really thinking it will be a great conclusion from this conference if we can think of a way, how can we set up this collaborative efforts, hopefully with the help of the international organizations, of course, to support us with that. But that was just my thinking, and if you have better ideas or more ideas how we can do this, then I'd be extremely happy to join the conversation. Thanks.
great actually end to the summary end for this. But if you want to react, 30 seconds, Philippe, please.
So I think there's a common theme here. So let me, and it's exactly the last point, which is there's a confluence of different perspectives, which all point, I think, to a common conclusion, which is we do need EU level data statistics. So let me point to that. One is to complete the OECD tax reform. At some point, we have to move to having a sense of the kind of allocation of the tax base across the member countries. Two, many people think with capital markets union and banking union, the natural way this is going to maybe grow is if we have EU level firms. So in other words, we don't need to have one size fits all. We don't need to have a common reporting below a certain scale. But above a certain scale, having a single reporting will also facilitate having cross-border. In other words, this be a collection of highly transparent firms which everyone in the European capital markets would understand, rather than having to wade through different national, if you like, reporting. And to the extent when we think about a lot of what you're and also possibly some people might think about own resources for the Commission and now, of course, they're kind of not everyone has a perfectly aligned interests in all of this. So it's obvious they're not perfectly aligned interests. So the last ingredient here is political will. And so it's not going to be the people in this room who will actually deliver this. But for example, this year, there are two initiatives which will report, I think, in the coming months. One is led by Enrico Letta on improving the single market. And then there's the competitiveness report by Mario Draghi. And, if these point, look, the only way to square the circle about financing the green transition, accelerating growth rate in Europe and so on, is basically to have a more integration at the European level. To do that, there are, I think, conceptually ready to go initiatives like this, which may help. So I can see a pathway. There's other pathways which don't lead there, but there's at least one pathway which does lead in that direction.
Yes, very shortly, I think your point with regard to the distribution of information inside enterprise groups. I would simply like to say that's for me, I'm with some experience, I would like to say in some enterprise groups it works very well, that they all know what is going on, also with the individual parts of the enterprise, and others they simply don't, still right now. And that's an important thing when we think about the burden for enterprises. I will not answer the question of what is the right label to label green bonds. That's a little bit too tricky for me to do it right now. But I would also like to say, as I mentioned, with regard to the concrete step forward, I think the most promising way forward with regarding to carbon data is a joint initiative together with standard setters, etc. So that everything statistics, standard setters, firm level accountants, and that's all the same source. As a balance of payments compiler, which is some years ago, then I would like to say it was always difficult to explain the specific statistical needs which differ from normal accounting in enterprises. And this makes it difficult. And if we have here the chance to start from the very beginning on to do it jointly, that can have very fruitful things and perhaps a much better data quality in the medium to long term, for sure. Thank you.
So they're conscious for the time. So thanks you so much, and hopefully we'll have a nice agenda. So let's clap.